When I received the letter from the Jacksonville law firm, I was skeptical. In recent years, scammers have been trying to take advantage of the gullible, and this seemed like just that. Someone formally informing me of an inheritance of an estate I had never heard of. But when I opened the letter and saw the stamp of a legitimate law firm, I was curious. It contained information about my great-grandmother, whom I had honestly never heard of. I had always thought our family was small, but it turned out that the roots went deeper than I thought. My mother mentioned that Georgia Benson, my paternal great-grandmother, was someone the family had long since lost touch with. No one talked about her much, and her name seemed to have faded into the past. My mother explained that it was probably because of some old disagreement, but she didn't know the details, or maybe she just didn't want to talk. The idea that I might be an heir seemed strange to me. I was a normal guy. I worked for a small construction company, rented an apartment in the suburbs of Atlanta, and never thought about rich relatives or unexpected gifts of fate. All this seemed like something that only happened in movies or books, but not in my life. Still, I decided it was worth finding out what was what. I made an appointment with a lawyer, and 2 days later found myself in his office. It was a small, cozy room in an old building that smelled of leather bindings and coffee. The lawyer seemed collected, clearly an expert in his field. He explained that Georgia Benson had left me a house as an inheritance. This was unexpected and even a little scary. I had never owned a house before, and I did not even know how to feel about it. However, it was not that simple. The house needed repairs, and the will spelled out certain conditions that had to be met in order to preserve the inheritance. The lawyer strongly recommended that I go and see the house in person before making a decision. So, a couple of days later, I was driving down a winding road that led into a wooded area outside of Jacksonville. The road seemed endless, and along the way I noticed how the landscape had changed. Old mailboxes overgrown with grass, the occasional house with peeling paint, and long stretches of gravel driveways made it seem like time had stood still. I didn't know what to expect, but my heart began to beat faster with every mile I drove. The house turned out to be an old Victorian mansion surrounded by thick trees. It looked like it hadn't been touched by human hands in decades. The paint was peeling, the shutters were hanging in places, and the porch was slightly askew. The long gravel driveway was littered with leaves, and there were thick bushes growing around it that hadn't been trimmed in a long time. Still, there was something inviting about the house, something that spoke of its former grandeur. When I opened the door, the smell of old wood and dust hit my nose. Inside, everything looked as if life had suddenly stopped here. The floors creaked slightly, the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the walls were decorated with old wallpaper with faded patterns. Despite the state of the house, I felt something special about it. It seemed that every corner kept a story that was yet to be revealed. I decided not to rush to conclusions. I needed to think everything over and understand whether it was worth taking on this unexpected responsibility. As I walked through the rooms, it seemed more and more to me that the house was not just an inheritance, but a whole world full of mysteries that I had never suspected before. The next day, I returned to the house with a set of the most basic tools, a flashlight, a notepad, and a camera on my phone. I decided that I needed to look around first, make a list of what needed to be fixed, and try to figure out what I was going to do about it. It was obvious that the house had been abandoned for a long time, but the more I looked around, the more I was struck by how well some of the details were preserved. The walls, although faded, were solid. The floors, although creaky, did not cave in. Even the windows, at first glance, looked solid enough, despite the thick layer of dust. First, I walked around the first floor. It was a classic layout, a large living room with high ceilings, where there was a fireplace made of marble, slightly warped by time. The kitchen was small but cozy, with a massive cast-iron stove, which must have been here at the beginning of the last century. I managed to find a pantry, where, to my surprise, some kitchen utensils were preserved. They looked like antiques and could certainly interest one of the collectors, but I did not attach much importance to this. In the living room, I noticed an old sideboard with frosted glass doors. They were slightly jammed, but I managed to open them by pulling a little harder. Inside were books, stacks of old volumes, mostly novels, and a couple of thick notebooks with leather covers. I did not touch them right away, deciding to return to them later when I finished my inspection. As I climbed to the second floor, I increasingly felt as if the house was waiting for me. With each step upward, the creaking of the stairs echoed dully in the silence. There were several bedrooms on the second floor. One of them, apparently, had once been occupied by my great-grandmother. The room was large, with a wide bed under a canopy, shabby, but still sturdy. On the bedside table stood a lamp with a lampshade, and, surprisingly, it worked when I plugged it into the outlet. The window opened onto an old garden. Even after decades, one could see that someone had once tended it with love. I decided that if I stayed here, I would try to restore the garden to its former beauty. When I went down to the basement, a feeling of slight anxiety came over me. This was the only place in the house where the air seemed especially musty. There were streaks on the walls here and there, and the floor was covered with a layer of dust and fallen leaves that must have flown in through the old window. But among all the old furniture, boxes, and crates, there was a small chest. It was wooden, with tarnished brass locks and a faded emblem on the lid. I tried to open it, but it was locked. On the way back home, I couldn't get the chest out of my head. Why was it locked? What could great-grandmother have kept in such a strange place? I decided I'd have to go back with tools to figure out the lock, but for now I focused on organizing my thoughts. I started looking through my notes. The house needed some work, but it didn't look hopeless. Ideas started to flash through my mind about how I could fix it. A new roof, a porch repair, a clean out of the walls, all seemed doable. But I didn't know what to do with the trunk and the old books. They seemed to hint that there was something more to this place than just a house. The next day I went there again. Equipped with a crowbar and a flashlight, I decided to open the trunk. It turned out to be easier than I thought. The lock gave way easily, and the lid lifted with a long creak. Inside were papers, photographs, and a few personal items. The first thing I saw was an old leather folder. Opening it, I found letters written in a clear, confident hand. Most of them began with the same salutation, "Dear Georgia." Judging by the dates, the letters were written in the 1940s. They were full of warm words and references to family, but one name was repeated especially often. I noticed that Georgia had apparently been corresponding with someone she loved very much, but had never told her family about them. I carefully put the letters back in the chest to study them later. In addition to the letters, I found an old photo album. The faded pictures were of people I did not know. Georgia was probably among them, but I could only guess which of the women in the photo was her. These people looked happy, on picnics, at home, in the garden. Some of the photos showed glimpses of the interior of the same house, but in a much more tidy form. At that moment, I realized that the inheritance was more than just a house. It was the history of a family I knew next to nothing about. As I left that day, I was still wondering what those letters, photographs, and trunk meant. Perhaps I was not only tasked with tidying up the house, but also with restoring lost pieces of family history. I spent the next few days sorting through the contents of the trunk and pondering my next steps. Everything in the house seemed to be urging me to learn more. The letters, photographs, and even the books in the cupboard were like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. I had no idea who these people were, what their relationship was to my great-grandmother, or why she had chosen me to be her heir. But I knew one thing for sure. These finds had awakened in me a strange sense of attachment to the house. I started with the letters. I laid them out on the living room table and arranged them by date. The first of them were written in 1943. Most of the letters began with "Dear Georgia," and it was clear that the writer, whose name was Arthur, was writing to her from afar. It was clear that the letters came from the front. Arthur described his days, talked about his comrades in arms, and dreamed of returning home. But the further I read, the more I felt that there was a special connection between them. Each letter had a sincerity, even a tenderness that was impossible to miss. Towards the end of 1944, the tone of the letters began to change. Arthur wrote less often, and his stories became shorter and darker. In the last letter, dated January 1945, he mentioned that he would soon be transferred to another regiment, and that the chances of returning home were becoming increasingly slim. At this point, the correspondence ended. These letters haunted me. Who was this Arthur? Why did my great-grandmother keep them all her life? Was he part of our family? In search of an answer, I returned again to the photographs. In the album, I noticed a man who had appeared in several pictures taken during the same years as the letters. He was young, in uniform, with a confident smile. In some of the pictures, he was standing next to Georgia. Their poses and looks said more than words could. It was clear to me that there was definitely a relationship between them, but beyond that, I could only guess. In addition to the letters and photographs, I found a small box wrapped in cloth in the chest. Inside was a ring. It was simple, with a small engraving on the inside that said the date, June 12, 1943. It looked like an engagement ring. Perhaps Georgia and Arthur were engaged or even married in secret, but then why did no one in the family know about it? Or did they know, but chose to remain silent? These thoughts swirled around in my head as I continued to fix up the house. I started small, clearing out the porch, replacing a few broken boards, and raking up the leaves. Then I started gardening. I found the process surprisingly enjoyable. As I dug through the dirt, I found traces of past care. Stone paths, an old fountain hidden under a layer of moss, and the remains of flower beds where flowers had once grown. Each element I found seemed to tell a story, reminding me how beautiful this house had once been. However, despite all this effort, I wasn't sure that I really wanted to keep the house. I went back to the lawyer's office to work out the details of the estate. I had to live in the house for at least a year before I could sell it. At first, this seemed like a tall order, but the more I was in the house, the less I wanted to part with it. It was starting to become more than just a set of walls and a roof. The neighbors I had met also fueled my desire to stay. They were mostly older people who remembered Georgia. One woman named Mrs. Carter, who lived in the house next door, said that Georgia had always been a private person. After the war, she rarely interacted with others, but she was respected for her hard work and care for the house. According to Mrs. Carter, Georgia never mentioned a husband or children, which confirmed my suspicions that she kept her secrets deep inside. These stories made me think about how little we know about our ancestors. I began to feel a responsibility to restore at least some of Georgia's history. Perhaps for her, this house was the only place where she felt safe. For me, it could be the beginning of something new. One evening, sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee, I opened one of the leather notebooks from the sideboard. Inside, I found Georgia's writings. It was not a diary, but more of a collection of notes and reflections. She wrote about her days, the weather, the garden, but between the lines there were references to how much she missed someone who would probably never return. These entries were so lonely, but at the same time there was strength in them. Georgia continued to live, work, and take care of the house despite everything she had been through. At some point, I caught myself thinking that I wanted this house to return to the way it was when Georgia was alive. Maybe that's why she chose me as her heir. She knew that I could give the house a new life, while preserving its history. This idea grew stronger in me. I decided that I would try to stay. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew one thing. This house deserved to be restored and its history preserved. The decision to stay in the house was an important milestone for me. This was no longer just a project or an attempt to unravel family secrets. The house began to feel like a place that was waiting to be brought back to life. There was a lot of work ahead, but the more I did the renovations and improvements, the more connected I felt to the place. I started with the garden. It turned out to be a surprisingly calming activity. By removing weeds and trimming old bushes, I returned the area to its original appearance. I even found a place where there had once been a rose bed. Only wilted roots remained of the old flowers, but I decided to plant new ones, breathing life into the garden anew. With each passing day, the area began to resemble photographs from an album, and this inspired me to move on. At the same time, I began to renovate the interior of the house. These were simple things: repainting the walls, replacing the floorboards, strengthening the stairs that were in danger of falling apart. Every corner of the house revealed new details about Georgia. In one room, I found an old box of children's books. They may have belonged to my grandfather when he was a child, but the fact that Georgia had kept them spoke of her love for her family, despite the differences. The locals began to notice the changes. One day, while I was fiddling with the door frame, a neighbor, Mr. Green, came up to the house. He looked at me for a long time, and then said with a smile, "Georgia would be proud of you." Those words meant a lot to me. I felt like I was doing something important, not only for myself, but also to honor the memory of a person who may have been underappreciated in life. By the end of the first month, life in the house had settled into a certain rhythm. I found a part-time job so I could spend more time here, and even made a habit of walking around the property every evening. These walks became a ritual for me, a time for reflection. Arthur's letters, found in the trunk, kept coming back to me. I decided to learn more about him and his fate. To do this, I turned to the local archives. Jacksonville turned out to be a small town where the archivists were happy to help. A few days later, I managed to find records indicating that Arthur Samuels had likely died in 1945 in France. His name was on a memorial to fallen soldiers in the city park. This discovery was both sad and encouraging. Now I knew that Georgia may have lost not only a loved one, but also her hope for a new life. This explained her isolation, which the neighbors described. However, this search also brought me an unexpected surprise. Among the archive documents, I came across a mention of Arthur buying a ring at a local jewelry store. The date on the invoice matched the engraving on the ring I found. It turned out that he had planned to officially marry Georgia, but the war ruined their plans. This ring became for me a symbol not only of their love, but also of the strength with which Georgia continued to live. Soon after, I decided to organize a small meeting with the neighbors. I wanted to tell them about my plan to restore the house and invite them to help me with this. It turned out that many of them happily supported my idea. Mrs. Carter brought an old photograph of the house in its heyday, and Mr. Green offered to help repair the roof. Little by little, the house began to become not only my project, but also a common concern for the entire neighborhood. By the summer, the house had been transformed. From the outside, it no longer looked abandoned. The painted walls, new porch, and updated garden attracted the attention of passers-by. There was still a lot of work to do inside, but the most important changes had happened inside me. This house had become a home for me in the truest sense of the word. I no longer felt like a random guest, but like I had found my place. The final touch was that I decided to create a kind of memorial to Georgia and Arthur in one of the rooms. I placed their photographs, letters, and ring there. For me, it was a way to immortalize their story. I also wrote a short article about the house and sent it to the local newspaper. It received a response, and soon several locals shared their memories of Georgia. Their stories completed my picture of her life. By the end of the year, I realized that I no longer wanted to leave this house. At first, it was unfamiliar and mysterious to me, but over time it became a place where I could feel connected to the past and at the same time look to the future. Georgia left me more than just walls and a roof. She left me a legacy that inspired me to start a new life. Looking back, I feel grateful for this unexpected turn of fate. The house has become a reminder of how important it is to maintain a connection to family history and the places that shape us. Now, when I walk through the garden and see the roses in bloom, I feel part of something bigger. This house is more than just a legacy, it is my new start.